You're watching News at Prime. Let's get into this discussion now. Djibouti's Foreign Minister, Mahmoud Ali Youssouf, has been elected as the new African Union Commission Chairperson, taking over from Chad's Moussa Faki, who's held the post since 2017. He secured support of two-thirds of the region's leaders, beating former Kenyan Prime Minister Raila Odinga. Algeria's Selma Haddadi was elected as the Deputy Chairperson. Let's speak now to Africa Analyst Dr. Charles Sinkala, who joins us from Addis Ababa at the venue of that summit. Dr. Sinkala, good evening to you and thank you for your time. Let's start with the election of the new African Union Commission Chairperson. There were some misgivings about the caliber of the three front runners, and some suggesting that these three candidates, they were not of the high caliber expected. And I'm not saying this, it's not my words, it's the think tank, it's called Amani Africa, that suggested this in their report. Your thoughts on the election of the new African Union Commission Chairperson?
Thank you very much. It's not a matter of the caliber of the one who heads the AU, but it's about the sending country. You know, I was with the opinion that, you know, we should have had the head of the union from these major economies, say Nigeria, South Africa, Zambia, and many others, you know, rather than a small country which can be easily be manipulated. The systematic system in terms of the bureaucratic governance of the AU, it's you know, it's quite complicated. You know, even though they may have somebody who is very strong, but if the sending country to be the head of the AU can be influenced by his own country, you know, it can succumb to that. And many of the issues that are facing AU now and before, even maybe in future, is about the delegation or the implementation of their policies, which has been considered by many as being ceremonial. Yes, they can impose sanctions to member states, but how can actually they impose sanctions to member states who are actually funding them? These are issues that needed to be debated.
Yeah, and apart from the elective element of this summit, what were some of the key outcomes for you in this gathering?
We had the new players. You know, we had the president of Botswana, Boko, who came up with a very Pan-Africanism agenda, you know, push what he calls that we need to protect our continent. You know, we need to industrialize our continent. We need not to seek elsewhere support, but the 1.4 billion Africans can support the agenda of the AU, and that they must really look at who's funding the AU so that the policies and the implementation of thereof can never be influenced. But it is quite a big challenge that the AU has done quite a lot of stride in terms of the shaping of Africa, but most of these end up on the talk show. You know, a lot of conflicts has emerged from the continent, which sometimes they come up very late to respond to them, like what happened in Mozambique. After a lot of thousands of people have died in Mozambique, that's when they came to make an emergency meeting. DRC has been in conflict for over 65 years. West Africa, then they are even different, that they even dumped their ECOWAS, the one which is just under the continental body AU. So there's quite a lot of challenges which were discussed, but the energy that just comes out of the conference, like now immediately when it ended, you know, just gets distinguished because it can't see any room of being implemented. As them, they do not implement. Individual member states, they must implement the reforms.
Yeah, you talk about the wars that are raging in parts of the continent. We'll come to that in a moment. The overarching theme of this summit, Dr. Sinkala, was justice for Africa through reparations. For you, was there a clear roadmap about how this will be implemented?
Not at all, not at all. Yes, they've talked about it many years ago. They started this with Organization of African Union Unity, rather, which was disbanded in year 2000 when the formation of AU was formed. It has always been talked about in terms of the reparations, those of the Black Africans who were sold as slaves. They were never compensated. But those who used to do slave trade, those companies, they suffered detrimental damages to their properties. They were fully compensated. And this has gone on and on and on. And I think to some extent that the AU is incapacitated in terms of pushing that and holding those countries to account, such as the United Kingdom. United Kingdom has got a lot of programs in terms of funding. The European Union as well, they are part of the funders of the AU. So they can only push to an extent that they do not damage those bilateral and multilateral relationships. But the AU's reforms is an ongoing process. We see a process that probably in future they should have their own continental commission, which just looks up to a justice like the ICC. But this would be basically for the continent's purpose. But we have seen as well that people are tired for waiting for that long. I mean, in 1962 years ago, when the AU was formed, one could have been 1 year old. Now they're 63 years old. Yeah. And that's why now we have the agitators for something different. We had this week already, we had the formation of African People's Union, that would be representing the individual people, of the African continent, to represent them on different forums, to represent them in such occasions, such as the reparation, to speak to bilateral and multilateral relationships so that something can be done.
And we talk about that theme of justice for Africa through reparations. For some, the counter to this is that the time has come to break free from dependency on Western nations. Did that view find expression at all in this summit?
Well, Africa suffers from bigger challenges. Some of the problems, it's self-actuated problems. You can't break free from a certain system that has been feeding Africa for many years. We have to find something like an alternative before you can break. Look at certain things that would like to ban in terms of importation into the African continent. We do not have the industries to manufacture. If China or any other manufacturing hubs in the world can say, okay, you're saying you want to break free, you want to be independent, then manufacture your own shoes, manufacture your own cell phones, manufacture your own cars. The question is, can we do that? No, we can't. I think Africa must start, renegotiating the terms in terms of the scramble for Africa, the owners of the real owners of these territories that we occupy. In fact, these territories, we must emphasize that these territories were bought at an auction in 1884, 1885, what we call the scramble for Africa. I call it the auction of Africa. So the owners of these territories, we have to renegotiate with them because we continue to pay colonial taxes to them.
Yeah. Let's talk about the conflicts that are raging then on the continent. Silencing the guns on the continent of Africa is a key priority of the AU's Agenda 2063 program. A simple question to you: is the continent any closer to achieving this goal?
No, you can't. You can't silence the guns, That is a rhetoric of trying to say we should end the war. You can't end the war when the other nations are fighting you. You can't end the war that Africa hasn't attained our economical status, in terms of feeding ourselves, producing what she can feed. The only time you can end the war and put the guns down is when the fight for the emancipation of Africa, especially the peoples of Africa, they get their own share of what is endowed into this continent. That's when you can down tools. I've never heard any European nation or even the United States of America to say that they shall put the stop to guns manufacturing. That is just something that was made by Robert Gabriel Mugabe in the Agenda 2063, I don't think it will even see any light. You can see as well what happened recently, where even 13 South Africans were killed. So how do you put down the guns when the Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, sends soldiers with the guns to go and fight in DRC, and consequently we had the loss of lives from the South African part. So it is impossible, it is far-fetched to talk that Africa soon, or even in 100 years, whoever put the guns down, in terms of victory.
Yeah, and you talk about these conflicts. There is still fierce fighting. In fact, it is called a civil war that is ongoing in South and Western Sudan. You then have the Eastern DRC conflict. The assumption was that these were going to be very high up on the agenda. Were there any clear plans to try and end these wars?
No, not at all, not at all. Remember, the issue of Sudan is not a recent issue. That issue has dated back 20, 30 years ago, as Sudan was split into two, the Northern Sudan, the original Sudan, and the South Sudan, and those conflicts continues without any hope. In fact, the United Nations at one time, they mentioned that they have to have the two-state solution for those to be independently to hold those countries. That hold some conflicts for some time, but because of the southern part of Sudan is mineral wealth, there's a lot of raw players there, especially from the outside. So is the Democratic Republic of Congo. With the Democratic Republic of Congo is something different. The country is one, but there's an imminent coup, which is in process. And although the people or the international community, including President Felix Tshisekedi, they are in denial, and they are pointing a finger to the M23 and Rwanda that they are causing confusion. Meanwhile, the country has been with a history of coup d'etats. We can't forget the Congo War, 1996, 1997, when the president, Laurent Kabila, was killed. Also as far back as 1960, 1961, when Patrice Emery Lumumba was killed, and they replaced him with Mobutu Kukumbendungu wa Zambanga. It is a confused situation on the African continent that we hold talks and conferences, but meanwhile we are neglecting the cry of the people, the dying of the people in the continent, and that hasn't been televised. Now the media has been consumed by these so much conferences and workshops which talks about peace, and we don't have peace in the continent.
Well, you talk about these conferences that are organized by the organization such as the AU, which I think, to sum up your words, they somehow end up to nothing. Interestingly, the Munich Security Conference was taking place at the very same time as the AU summit in Addis Ababa. And this weekend, I listened very closely to the EU bloc foreign ministers who were talking about their individual countries' plans. These are budget plans to beef up the defense in waiting for whatever eventuality, if Russia indeed does intend to continue this fighting between itself and Ukraine. Yet you come to the continent and SADC is simply unable to plan properly to defeat the M23. Is that a fair comparison?
Well, it is a fair comparison because the EU is, the EU is a continent, so is Africa. The EU, is quite united. I know they could have one or two problems, but they do not have as serious problems as we have. Look at how they introduced the euro currency for you to use within the European Union, which they have stabilized their economies. They can't be all good, but but there's a sense of them working together in terms of peace and security, and in terms of economic activities. You can't just go open up a company in the European Union without the recommendations or approval there too. But for the African continent, We invite the so-called investors these visitors who come here, at the end of the day, they milk us to nothing. So now the continental part of Africa itself, the heads of states, yes, they talk in these conferences and workshops that we see, but deep down, the actions, we don't see any physical actions in terms of them deciding. At the end of the day, like what you said, these conferences, they end up on lip service. It actually ends up on a photo shoot, just like the way the AU ended up, the AU conference this afternoon ended up on a photo shoot.
Very harsh words indeed. Dr. Charles Sinkala, thank you very much for your analysis of the AU summit, concluding that gathering this weekend. And we're going to continue the conversation around this and indeed the threats that continue to come from the West when we return.